Aaron, thanks for joining us on what is the maiden voyage, sort of our podcast, Pastor Baptist Church. We're in our new recording studio, so you get to be the one to break it in. And it wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Pastor Sergey. So, brother, I know you're sitting in the room, you're not on a mic, but thank you for your efforts. We are in the midst of a missions conference in the life of our church, and we have different church planters coming in from other parts of the world. And I am joined today by Aaron Murray. Some of us know who you are, some of us don't. Why don't you just introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, how you came to Christ. It'd be a good place to start.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure, honor to be part of the maiden voyage of the podcast. I grew up in Southern Ontario, about an hour and a bit down the road from Hespeler, in Delhi. Spent most of my formative young adult life there. Came to Christ in my third university.
Okay.
It was a bold friend that asked me, hey, what do you know about Jesus? I had grown up in a Dutch Reformed family, knew a lot about Jesus, didn't know Jesus. God used his voice, his conversation, his discipleship group that was part of Power Change, and local church. Those three kind of together over the course of 3 or 4 months in my third university led me to Christ.
Okay. Where were you studying university?
I was in St. Catharines.
St. Catharines?
Brock University. St. Catharines, yeah.
Okay. Amazing. Yeah. Tell us about the city where you're a church planter. That's what you're doing right now, and that's why you're here. Tell us about the city where you're planting. What does it look like? What's interesting about the place where you serve? Fun facts. Just tell us where you are right now.
Yeah, so we are in the region of Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, Quebec, which is about 2.5 hours north of Quebec City. So you get to Quebec City, there's a park, a national park, the Laurentian Mountains, and then you get spit out on the other side, and that's where we are.
Sure. So this is rural Quebec.
Yeah, in a sense, like it's the whole region's only about 200,000 people. It's a big geographic area.
Okay.
The city of Chicoutimi itself is about 70,000.
Yep.
And so Chicoutimi is actually like an indigenous word that means like end of deep water. And so the Saguenay River attaches to the St. Lawrence.
Okay.
And so that's where the name of the city came from.
Okay.
And that's really the people there, the culture there is really centered around the outdoors.
Okay.
So mountain, like rock climbing, mountain climbing, fishing, hunting.
Okay.
Everybody owns a snowmobile, a quad.
Do you? Not yet?
I do not yet.
Okay. Is that in your future?
Yeah, we'll see. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But yeah, so it's really centered around the outdoors. I love fishing. Like I love being outside, all that kind of stuff. So that would be like the lifestyle kind of matches. Very similar to what we were living in Northern Ontario. Perfect. Which is one of the reasons we ended up going there. But yeah.
What was the moment in your life that made you decide to become a church planter?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I would say late 2017, I had taken my wife out for dinner, as one does when you have something important that you want to ask your wife that you're not sure how it's going to go. You have a nice dinner.
Buffer with the waiter.
Yeah, exactly. And we're living in like Northern Ontario, so the nice dinner is like, it was the Fifth Ave restaurant, all right? Like this is not, it wasn't the Keg or something something awesome, but we had gone out for a nice dinner, and I said to my wife, I think that I want to be part of church planting.
So what were you doing at the time? Like
I was a youth pastor.
You were a youth pastor.
We were living in Northern Ontario. I was a youth pastor at this church. My wife had her dream job there. She's she was a speech pathologist.
Oh, really?
In town.
Interesting.
We loved it there. And so I said, I think I want to be church planting. And in my mind, that meant Northern Ontario. Like there's lots of towns in Northern Ontario that need churches.
Absolutely.
Hey, I think I want to see if our local church will raise me up, send me out in Northern Ontario somewhere.
Got it.
And she said no. Okay. She was like, no, we just got here. Our life is centered here. This is ridiculous.
Sure.
And something a mentor had said years prior to that, when we first got married, is, Lord, Aaron, if you think the Lord's calling you something and he's not calling your wife, then he's not calling you either.
I agree.
And so, so I took that to heart in that moment. Mm-hmm. And I thought, you know what? Let's leave it there. And then a year later, the Lord called both of us to think about it together.
So over that course of the year, is there conversation?
Zero.
Are you praying about it together?
Zero.
So the Lord is
I was
just
still
working.
praying on my end.
Sure.
Like, God, I think I want to do this, but like, I also want to be where you're calling us,
right.
like me and my wife to be. And we had just had our first son as well. And so, yeah, we had 0 conversation for a year. And then we did a marriage course at our church where the pastor, our senior pastor at the time, he had encouraged us to read through the Bible with another couple that was part of the course with us.
Sure.
And so Zach and Olive, which is our ministry partners now, we read through the Bible together. And Zach jokingly said, 52 weeks is a long commitment, like Bible in a year, that's a long time. Let's do this thing in 52 days.
What? Really?
Really. For real.
And you guys were like on board with that?
We're like, let's do it. Like 52 days. So we took like McShane's year thing.
Sure.
And instead of 52 weeks, we had 52 days.
52 days.
Yep.
That's intense.
It's intense. It takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours every day.
Yep.
So we just committed to either getting up early or going to bed late.
And that's reading through portions of Scripture more than once, right? Like the McShane reading plan isn't just reading the Bible once. You're reading the New Testament twice, aren't you? And the Psalms twice. And anyway,
yeah.
That's intense. Good for you.
So we would kind of keep tabs on each other just through Messenger. Like we had one group chat that was only for check boxes. So like when you were done for that day, you put a little check mark. It was kind of, I don't know, some sort of accountability structure, but it was also encouraging to be like, oh, Zach's finished. Oh yeah, I got to do that.
Right.
And then every Sunday afternoon during those couple months, we would meet and just talk about what we were learning in the Word. Okay. And like when you read through the Bible that fast, obviously you're not meditating
you're
scriptures, but
like
you're looking,
view, right?
Yeah, you're looking big connections. And for all 4 of us, God really through His Word united us with the reality that, man, Jesus is worthy to be praised by every human being on this planet, and there's a lot of people going to hell. Yeah, and we need to do something about it. And so for us, we just started asking the question, what does this look like? Okay, and that led to we want to plant a church. Okay, be part of church planting.
So that is, you're in Ontario. You get to the point where, as 2 couples, you're looking at church planting. Then you end up in Quebec. Maybe we'll get to how that sort of happened. But if you go back to that moment where you, like, the Lord worked and you're clear, this is the direction that we're going to go in. If you could go back to that moment, having done what you've done now, what would you tell yourself? You've been involved in like church planting for how long?
We've been in our location only for a year.
Sure, but you've been moving towards it for a time.
3.5, 4 years since that kind of decision was made. Yeah.
So having learned what you have now, what would you say to yourself back at that moment where you're like, let's plant a church? Yeah. Any advice you would give yourself? Any wisdom? Any cautions? Any encouragement? What would you say to yourself?
Yeah, I think I would just repeat the refrain that we have in Scripture all over, like, fear not. Okay. You know, like, if you're convinced by the Spirit of God through His Word, this is where He's taking you. Like,
don't be afraid.
Put your fears aside and chase it.
Good word, brother. I think that's great. And I mean, you're right. It is a repeated refrain in Scripture all over the place. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Good. What is the hardest part about being a church planter? Obviously, you're saying that for a reason. Do not be afraid. So how does that relate to the things you've encountered, obstacles, things that you might have been afraid about along the way? What's been hard about being a church planter?
Yeah, I think especially in a cross-cultural context, you're always like you kind of replay every conversation, every interaction, every decision you make. And you're always like filtering it through this grid of like, did I read the signs right? Did I, you know? And you just like, the reality of where we are at is no matter how much like our core group, our little church community includes us, like you still just feel like a stranger every day. Sure. Like you wake up and you're just you're a stranger. You're an English person in a very French context. And like you can have immaculate French. People know you're not from there.
I hear you've got good French. Sergey tells me you guys have got good French.
Well, we're trying, and like the Lord has definitely like helped us in that in that regard. But yeah, you're always an outsider, especially in a region that's not transient. Like people are born there, they grow up there, they live there, they die there. Interesting. I met a 73-year-old guy at Tim Hortons that's never left the region. Really? He's got a chalet in Lac Saint Jean. He lives in Chicoutimi,
And that's
zero
it.
reason to even go to
To
Quebec
go-
City. Like,
Okay.
why would I leave? This place is the best place on earth, you
Okay.
know? And so
And then
you're just a
kind of
stranger.
parachuting in, and
Yeah.
so people think it's weird then? Like, why are you here? Does that generate that question of what are you doing here? You're an English speaker. Why are you in this part of Quebec?
Yeah, that's usually the question is actually, so you work for the military? And then when you say no,
That's the
then it's like,
assumption.
okay, so why are you here?
Okay.
If you're not part of the military,
What is
why
going
did
on?
you choose to
Yep.
move here? You know,
Sure.
like you weren't told to come here. You
Right.
chose, and,
Right.
and so it has left the door open for wonderful conversations.
Good.
But even in that, right, like I think one of the challenges is just, even in those conversations, it's like everything happens in a second language, a different context.
Sure.
You're like, man, how do I?
Convey this. How do you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Because it's
yeah.
not your heart language, not your first language.
Yeah.
Okay. What has been the flip side of the question is what have been the most encouraging sort of moments where you said you question, did I read the signs right? Am I reading God's providence right? Have we made the right decisions? Are there moments on the other side where you see the Lord working, doors are open, conversations happen, where you're like, no, we did read the signs right. We see God's hand in this. Any sort of encouraging stories, moments along those lines?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I would say like seeing our core group rediscover the beauty of the gospel.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk about the church in a little bit, but it's a group that hadn't had a pastor for 7 years.
Okay.
A church that had voted to close, and so they became our core group to plant this church.
Yeah.
And my wife was just at a women's retreat, like kind of a regional for all the churches from anywhere in Quebec, really.
Okay.
To come up to this camp and have a women's retreat. And they were sitting at a table, and one of the ladies was sharing a struggle that was going on in just her life. And one of the ladies from our church said, "So how's the gospel good news?" In
Okay.
that conversation, and like to see that people in our core group are asking that question.
Fabulous.
Because that's been the refrain for this whole year, is like just reestablishing or refinding,
Sure.
rediscovering in a way the beauty of the gospel and its pertinence for all of life.
Okay. Amazing. How many people are in that small group? You mentioned that a couple of times, or that core group.
Yeah, so our core group is about 17. Like we
Great.
have 17 members.
Yep.
And then some kids and,
Okay.
and teenagers and stuff in there too. But yeah.
Good. Why isn't there? Talk a little bit about that. Tell us a little bit about the church. You said that that church had voted to close.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's a need in this part of the world. Tell us a little bit about the extent of that need, and then I'll follow up with why aren't there more church planters? What can we do to have more? That type of thing. But tell us a little bit more about the sort of the gospel need, where you are, and yeah.
Yeah. So where we are, like Chicoutimi itself is 70,000 people, and there's 2 evangelical churches.
That's it.
Two.
Okay.
And like if we were all together, if we were all part of the same church, we might be 100.
Okay. All right.
So like that's our reality.
Wow.
And so this little group of 17 people was a decade ago a flourishing church of 150, 200 people,
Really?
which in Quebec is
Wow. Yeah.
nearing
sure.
mega church status.
Yeah, totally.
200 people. But yeah, over a decade ago, there was some series of unfortunate events. We'll just leave it at that
Sure.
for sake of
That's
time.
okay.
And so, yeah, a lot of people left. There's a lot of people in our region that would claim to be Christians that don't belong to local churches.
Okay.
And then this group dwindled to the 17 that we are now. And they kind of strung it along for 7 years.
7 years.
There was a period of a couple years where there was a pastor from Quebec, Quebec City, which is about 2.5 hours away, and he would drive up, stay the weekend, and drive
Preach,
back kind of
drive
a couple times a month.
Wow.
But yeah, they got to a point where they were like, "This is like, what are we doing?
Right.
We're having zero impact in our community.
Right.
We have no church to hand to our kids.
Right.
Like, what are we doing?"
Sure.
And so they had kind of closed. They had voted to close actually.
Okay.
And then a couple guys from our kind of strategic team as an association went up and interviewed every member and said, hey, we can't make promises,
Right.
but we have these 2 couples.
Okay.
Would you be willing to wait on your decision to see if this is a good fit?
Amazing.
And ultimately, it was a good fit.
Sure. So they voted to close. The Lord said no.
That's
I'm gonna
right.
send you some church planters.
Send you some English kids. You know? Good luck.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good luck.
So,
Amazing.
yeah, so that's where we are. And like, I think church planting, it's hard to, well, one, in a good sense, I think we do get the pictures painted that it is difficult.
Sure.
And I think that's a good thing.
Yep.
Because
It's reality.
you don't have guys coming in that have this like kind of glamorous view of it.
Right.
And so I think that is important. But at the same time, I'm not sure that we talk about it as much as we probably could, right?
Okay.
Like I grew interested in church planting because I kind of went out and sought it out, but like
I
it wasn't
see.
because anyone at my local church was
Right.
like,
Right.
"Hey, we should plant a church,"
Okay.
you know.
Okay.
And I think, yeah, that like and we set these benchmarks too, like where okay, when we're this many people or we have this much money
Sure.
or then we can think about it. And it's like, man, what if we found innovative ways
Right.
to think about church planting, and not set those benchmarks, but set like, let's pray that the Spirit of God would raise people up and send people out, and like as that happens, then we'll figure out
The rest.
the resources that
Yeah.
are needed and
Yeah.
the amount of people, all these kinds of things, and not having like when we're 150 people, then we'll
Right.
plant, but
Right.
like rather when God raises up a planter among us, then we'll plant that
Sure.
kind of thing,
Sure.
you know.
Yeah, and that's so I all the more reason for the importance of this conversation is just to be talking about church planting with a church planter. That we've heard how the Lord has stirred you and your wife and Zach and all of as well, which is amazing. And then I appreciate the benchmark that you're talking about is there needs to be a planter. And so, like, talk a little bit about that need in Quebec. How much of a need is there for the praying that the Spirit of God would raise up church planters? I mean, here in Ontario, I'm sure it's in the fellowship. Last I heard, 37 churches, existing churches, don't have senior pastors. Like right now, I think it's the highest maybe that's ever been, and so the need for raising up of like pastors is huge. Would you say in Quebec is that a reason why there aren't more church plants? Is because there aren't more church planters?
Oh, absolutely. Like we're at a point where we don't have enough pastors to fill the churches that already
exist. And
So
there's
then
a
it's
need for more churches,
It's
right?
real hard to plant churches when you're like,
Yep.
okay, now this guy, is trained to be a pastor. How do you send him out to plant a church
Right.
when there's
All
30,
these-
35, 60 of them without pastors?
Sure.
And yeah, like we've got situations in Quebec where one guy's trying to like pastorally oversee 3-4 churches.
Oh man. Wow.
Yeah. And yeah, so it's tough.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other side of it too is the reality that there's not a lot of indigenous like
Right.
Quebecois guys
Right.
in the stream,
Right.
and so then you have guys like me showing up and like
Outside from
you have
outside
to
of Quebec.
they got to learn French
Yep.
first and like
And
even
culture.
then, culture.
Mhm.
And so it's a couple years before they can even effectively lead churches.
Right.
And then when they can, like you still have to have a group of people that's abundantly patient with them.
Sure.
So yeah.
That's quite a few factors, and it sounds like the response of that is has to be the Spirit of the Lord raising up.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I see happening in Quebec that I'm really appreciative of, and I'm praying that the Lord blesses, is this like raising up elders in local churches to pastor like their churches, right? Because
Sure.
when we have this kind of model of like, the reason this one guy is overseeing 4 churches is because he's like the sole pastor, and then you have teams of deacons everywhere.
Right.
Right. And so just the shift in mentality of like, let's raise up elders in local churches that
Yes.
are pastors, like elder pastors,
Elders
same thing.
yes. Amen.
And so like, you don't have to have a guy on staff. And I think moving forward, especially in rural Quebec, regional Quebec, like there's not a lot of resources.
Right.
And so to think that some of these churches would ever be able to pay a guy without outside support,
Right.
like that might just not happen. And so
Sure.
if we can raise up pastors to shepherd people, to pastor
Sure.
people from within churches, I think that could shift. And now we can plant church, like we can raise guys up to be church planters because we have elders
Right.
that are in their local churches.
Yeah.
You know?
Kind of sounds like the book of Acts.
A little bit.
Gospel's preached, people are saved, a church gathers, elders are appointed with prayer and fasting, and they shepherd the flock.
That's right.
So it's good. Burning question, or sort of obvious question we haven't answered yet or asked yet. Why rural Quebec? How did you wind up where you did from Northern Ontario? Why there?
Yeah. So like I mentioned earlier, when I was thinking about church planting, I was really thinking Northern Ontario.
Yeah, stay where you are.
Yeah. And like we love Northern Ontario. The rural, my wife and I are rural. We're
Okay.
country people.
Sure.
We love small town
Yep.
lifestyle.
She's small town
how
too.
we live.
Where's your wife from?
She grew up same kind of area,
Okay.
an hour and a bit from here. Just like farm kind of country,
Yep.
not hunting, fishing country, but
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
a lot of similarities.
Of course.
And so, yeah, as we talked with Zach and Olive, that was kind of what was in my head. And I had come up with a short list of a
Okay.
couple Northern Ontario towns
Right.
that didn't have churches.
Okay.
And I was like, man, I'd love to move to Hearst and plant a church.
Sure.
This is after Zach had mentioned Quebec.
Okay.
And I said, no, that like I don't speak French. They don't
Sure.
want English people there. Why would we bother?
Yeah.
And so I come up and I was like, Zach, what about if we move to Hearst? It's a town of 3,500 people, no church anywhere close to it. Why don't we think about church planting in Hearst?
Yeah.
We'll talk to our elders. He's like, you know that Hearst is like 95% French, right? And I didn't
May
know
as well-
that. I didn't know
obviously
that.
not.
I learned that in that moment. Yeah.
May as well go to Quebec then.
Exactly. So it was like, if you're willing to go there, why are you not willing to go to Quebec?
That's amazing.
And so, yeah, we had called like a few people that we knew, and they connected us with some guys in Quebec,
Okay.
and we just started the conversation. And so our heart right from the beginning was, man, we want to be part of church planting
Sure.
where there's a lack of gospel witness.
Right.
Like that, the glory of God and the reality of hell means we want to plant churches
Yeah.
where those two things are not happening.
Yeah.
Right. We didn't just want to, throw up a sign in the next town over
Sure.
kind of thing. It was like, no, we want to go, where there's
Where the greatest needs are.
a lack of gospel churches, and Quebec was on the top of that list. And we had said right from the get-go, the first time we ever talked to Sergey, who's now a pastor here, it's
Yeah.
pretty cool. We said, our heart is really for regional Quebec. Like,
Yeah.
we're willing. Like, we grew up in small towns. We love small towns.
Sure,
It's hard to
sure.
find planters to go to small towns.
Okay. Yeah.
I find a lot of our church planting conversations are always about urban
Urban,
ministry, which is
yep.
absolutely essential. And
Of course
I,
it is.
I,
A lot of
I
people
love-
live in cities. I get that.
Absolutely.
But-
and we talk about the church planting flowing downstream or the gospel flowing downstream. And I say, yeah, but the gospel flows downstream by people leaving and going.
Sure.
And those people are hard to find.
Right. Right.
Especially missionaries. Like I think as we receive missionaries in Quebec, a lot of them come from city centers in other countries. And so for
Right,
them, Montreal
right.
is like, it's hard enough to integrate into Montreal, let alone
Thinking about
somewhere
it, yeah.
4 hours away from Montreal
Yeah.
where it's very white French
Right.
culture.
Yep.
It's like when you're from South America, for instance, that's even harder than
Yeah,
Montreal,
absolutely,
where those pockets of different cultures exist.
Yeah. Right.
Right. And so we said, we're willing. We want to go to a small town. Like,
Okay.
let's work towards that end. And so even our time in Montreal was very much cultural acquisition and discernment. Where do you fit in this
Right,
puzzle of
right.
what we're trying to plant churches in Quebec and make disciples. Where do you guys fit?
Right.
And so that's why rural Quebec. We love rural. We were going to Quebec. Those two things kind of.
Yeah, they fit together, and so I've seen God's providence all over this, brother. Where you were born, where you grew up, things that you enjoy, the things that where your wife grew up, the things that she enjoys, where you lived, all used by God to direct you to being a church planter in Chicoutimi, Quebec. And we're thrilled to partner with you in the gospel. And anything else you want to say about church planting to anyone listening before we wrap up?
No, I would just encourage you to talk to some people that are doing it or excited about it and ask all the questions that maybe this podcast
Sure.
kind of brought into your mind or questions that you've had. Like, talk to people about it. Like one thing about church planters is they love to talk about church planting.
There you go.
So,
So
if you ask them, you'll get an hour and a half conversation.
That's good. So if you're listening to this, reach out to us. We'll connect you with Aaron. He would happily, I just heard him say, talk to you about church planting for an hour and a half, and you can pick his brain. I'm sure there's lots more that you could say, that we could learn from you. We'll wrap it up there, brother. Thank you, though, for your time. And like I said, thrilled to partner with you in the gospel. And may the Lord use you and your team there to see people brought from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light.
Thank you, brother. It's a pleasure.